Um, and that's partly because we've got at least one academy that's got an open evening, and so staff haven't been able to attend these. And perhaps also you would have liked to have gone into more than one of these Q&As, and so you'll be able to go back and watch one of the QAs from before. So this is the first time we've done this as LAP PD, so it's quite exciting, and I hope that you've enjoyed the video, which is a brilliant way to see the amazing practice that has gone on across the trust. It's a good opportunity to share practice. So we're going to follow up that video with these separate Q&A sessions of this one I'm hosting. The overall theme has been around challenge and setting challenge and establishing the right climate in our classrooms, and I'm delighted that James agreed to take part. Lee Academy Blackheath, one of their values is scholarship, and so we asked James to talk about that, as you will have seen in the video, and then we're going to follow that up with some questions around that. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat and I will try and get through as many as I can. I'll just start us off. Having watched that video, so James, you talk about challenge and scholarship informing the curriculum choices that have been made at Lee Academy Blackheath. But it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit more about what scholarship actually looks like in a lesson, in a typical lesson at Blackheath.
So I think scholarship starts obviously before the lesson. It starts before when we're looking at the curriculum and the content we've decided to deliver. And where you have subjects with a degree of freedom, be that what text they study in English or what artists they study in art, or the emphasis you decide to place in certain scientific aspects in science, it's ultimately about ensuring that you open the eyes of these students up, but also you ensure that as teachers, you are fully aware of what your curriculum is, what it's related to, and how well it's sequenced. Then ensuring your staff are aware of the curriculum and why it's sequenced the way it is. And then ensuring that they've got the good subject knowledge, because it's absolutely really vital that the subject knowledge is impeccable as much as possible. And then that bit before the lesson, once that groundwork's laid before the lesson, it comes about how are you teaching, what style of teaching are you going to be choosing? And authenticity here. So there isn't a one set here. And when we first started, and no one from lab is on this course, so it's fine, I can say, is the idea that like we did try a little bit of a more rigid model and it just didn't seem to work. We realized quite quickly that how I teach compared to someone else is radically different, and you can't duplicate that. So giving the teacher that autonomy in their classroom, but then also giving them a toolkit alongside that autonomy so they can pick and choose what they want to do. So once you've got all the backgrounds, you've got the curriculum, the sequencing, the subject knowledge, the toolkit, and the faith in yourself and the confidence of your leaders to teach the way you want to teach, you then get to see it happening in a lesson. And we all know as professionals in this field that students are quite quick at judging and trusting or not trusting the person in front of them delivering stuff. If all that background's done, then you're halfway there. So it turns to what happens in the class. So we need to make sure that there's opportunities coming out of your ear rolls so they can really try and stretch themselves, and you can stretch those students as well. And that might seem easy when you're starting a school from scratch or you're teaching top set, but what if you're teaching bottom set on a Friday afternoon? How can you really ensure that scholarship is going to happen? You need to think about all those things we've already discussed, but ultimately ensure that there's an element of responsibility as a teacher to be engaging with your stuff, but also to hold the students to account as well. So it's a massive combination to ensure that these students are having those opportunities to push themselves. So that ultimately comes in the form of challenge. We ensure that we have all those opportunities we spoke about, and we use the devices that our students are blessed with as well. We have a one-to-one device here at lab, and that really helps those pre-planned bits of challenge we'll chuck out. And we all know those instances where like, oh crap, they've finished, and it's supposed to be a 20-minute task, but they've finished it in 10 minutes. So to ping something else out to them as well, it gives you that opportunity and that freedom to stretch that. That's a really long-winded answer, and I think I semi-answered what your question was, but apologies if it was a bit vague.
Yeah. No, it's great. I'm going to ask a little bit more about it. Also, I've had the real opportunity of coming into Blackheath. This is the third year of me coming in and being able to sit in some of the lessons and see some of the things that you're talking about in action. Just for context for everybody else, Blackheath have now got year 10, so they've got 7, 8, 9 and 10, which might inform a question later that's on the chat. But many of those lessons are mixed ability, so you've been able to establish that culture of scholarship in a mixed ability comprehensive setting. And one of the things that I've noticed when I've watched those lessons is around the teacher expectations of answers from students. I wondered if there was something you could expand on that. So when a teacher asks a question, what's the expectation? Oh my God, I'm repeating back to myself. I think some people are not on mute. I'm hearing my voice. What's the expectation from the students? So a teacher will ask a question, what are they getting from the students back that means that they are challenged?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a challenge. Like, it makes you really respect primary school teachers a lot more, and sort of schools that don't set, because mixed ability teaching is a challenge, and it's something that I wasn't familiar with before I came here. And we've all probably heard of like Pygmalion in the classroom, you know, you teach to the top and a lot of kids will fall in line and push themselves, but that does manifest quite a lot, and that helps with the culture setting. You don't get these sync groups, these classes that you dread teaching because there's full of low attaining students or large pockets of SEN students interrupt the pace, etc. But it does mean that you've got to be that bit sharper, right, as a practitioner, to make sure your resources and your explanations are tip top and differentiated well. So your main question is sort of about like how does that link to our culture and expectations? So if the teacher is aware of kind of what a good answer looks like, they've got good subject knowledge, or they know how the question they're asking links to prior knowledge, or what a really good model exemplar answer looks like, not accepting an answer that is below par is the right thing to do as a teacher. It's kind of like, got to be cruel to be kind. Ultimately, if they say something, you go, oh yeah, along the right lines. No, I'm sorry, that was wrong. Like, you can say nicer than that, but like the idea that a student having a full sense of security because they were kind of on the right tracks is actually quite toxic for their learning, and it's a breeding ground for misconceptions. So when you receive their answers and you ensure that every student in that class is tracking, using that consistency of language to make sure everyone is watching that student and can hear that, you can really listen to their responses. And earlier in my career, I was really guilty of kind of half listening to student answers, ones that kind of drone on and are really, really annoying. We've all got those kids in our classes. But really listen to what they're saying and stopping them when you need to, or asking them to expand if they need to, having the ammunition of quick sort of like mosquito bite questioning afterwards to get them to push it, and then listening to what they're saying and asking follow-up questions, and ensuring when they're answering these questions, making sure they're using the right language, the right vocabulary, the right terminology. There are a bunch of new words that these kids are learning every day that we take, and we're really aware of our tier 3 language, our really subject specific language. But what about that tier 2 language you're assuming that they understand? Do they really know the difference between the command words in your subjects? Is there a display of command words that you could make in your room so they could quickly reference, oh, that's what evaluate means, that's what justify means? And then with that in mind, making sure that they're talking in the academic register. So asking them to start something again if they're not speaking in full sentences, or if they're not saying why or giving a reason for something, or they're not saying the word correctly, really politely, really kindly get them to repeat it. And by setting that kind of tone in that culture, it helps drives the standards in a classroom. And because of the mixed ability setting, you've got great role models in there, but opportunities as well for those low ability students to learn, but also duplicate what they're hearing, and it actually begins to manifest in what they're saying. Then comes the more difficult part, get them to, like, they can say great answers, but can they then write good answers? And then it's a whole other kettle of fish as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and that's definitely what I've seen, the encouraging students to argue with each other and use the right kind of language in order to do that. And, you know, all teachers across all of the subjects training students in an academic register. So thank you. One of the questions that was on the chat, I just wanted to ask you, obviously you've not had GCSE outcomes, so you haven't been able to yet assess the impact, but what has been the impact of your curriculum? The question is of curriculum change, but perhaps your curriculum choices and this academic register and scholarship on the outcomes so far?
So I think, like, if you boil it down to a numbers game, like when you're starting a new school, your focus is always the oldest year group, right? And then it's sort of trickles down. And what we've been able to do is really ensure that there's been no lost years at Key Stage 3. Our current year 10s have been like a focus for us the entire time. And then we've managed to replicate that with the lower year groups down into Key Stage 3 as well. We all work in the real world, Charlie, and we all know that like we need to get these exams up, we need to have these interventions and take away some of our energy, our resources, manpower and budgets on that aspect. So it's a really valid point, like how journalism is working if you haven't had external quantifiable results. We obviously have our NYP data, and that's really robust, it's really strong. And we've also used that data to find what those gaps are. So just like lots of schools across the country, we have an issue of HAPS. Like our HAPS target residual is way bigger than it should be in certain subjects. We have these pockets. So it's about that constant reflection cycle to ensure that we get this data in, however robust it can be. And there's always an argument about how robust internally standardized and moderated data can be, but there's pretty rigorous things within schools and across the trust set up. So you have to trust your staff and trust the sort of systems in place, and then measuring that impact and seeing what are the pockets of good practice. So there's not a target residual in science. So what is science doing that maths aren't, when there's quite a lot of overlap? And then sometimes the thing about that is to getting opportunities to go in and seeing each other teach as well. So we've removed all kind of formal observations. I've never been observed as much in my life at lab, but I've never had someone sit in my lesson for an hour with a clipboard. So what's really nice about that is that open door policy, so that everyone gets to see that good practice, and that good practice spreads out a bit like I was going to say virus, and that's a really bad choice of words at the moment, but it spreads out into the community, and it gets that kind of infests everywhere to everyone to try everything whilst being authentic and having that good subject knowledge. So I think measuring impact can be done with our internal data for sure. But when we look at sort of exemplar work that we get from our sister schools, and we look at the work that our students are producing, it often is written in a really good way, and it is often of a high caliber. We've got issues about our GCSE students now. Oh, I think I know this topic in this English question, and then half of what they've written is not going to be useful. So we're learning from our other schools like Halle to ensure that we know when to rein it back and teach the kids to rein it back as well, so they don't just vomit on a page all their amazing knowledge. They know the context and content, but also they hit the question as well. So that's our big focus for year 10 now. So it's about knowing your strengths and weaknesses, looking at where they are, and spreading the resource and manpower out to impact everyone in the class, and then looking at the data and seeing where your successes are, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a very evidence-led school really up there, isn't there? Kind of everything you're doing is evidence-led. And there's
everything has to be backed up by research. So every bit of CPD we deliver has to be based on research. And I'm not talking about the new buzzword that's coming out this week on EduChat. I'm talking about something that's being science or has got like a renowned figure or a name behind it that can lend some muscle to what we're trying to do here. And that CPD is so important, because the research is telling us now that generic CPD, so basically what this isn't really the best way for people to get better as practitioners, subject-specific CPD. So we've dedicated a huge section of our Wednesdays to subject-specific PD. So we've given the departments more time. So it's not just about department time doing departments. I don't know if there's any heads of department in here. They're probably all at the Dole Forum, but you've all been in departmental meetings, guys, where so much of the meeting is operational. Like, this is when the deadline is. These are the assessments we need to do. Or it's moderation or standardization. How often in your times do you get to, let's look at this exam paper. How would you teach this difficult concept to difficult kids? Or how would you get the grade, essentially grade 9? And how do you teach that content? Because so much of the department time is taken away. So we've dedicated a chunk of our Wednesday CP to give that back, because, you know, as a member of SLT, there's a lots of stuff that you ask your middle leaders that you line manage to do. but the balance in lots of schools need to be readjusted.
I think that's a really fantastic thing to draw out there, James, the importance of the subject pedagogy. So that is what we should be focusing on much more now within our subject areas, and about making sure that that's really rooted in the evidence and the research, and then where you are sort of teaching things like writing across the other subjects, that there's some consistency for the students. We've got some really lovely, if people are looking at the chat, we've got some lovely ideas in there of sort of other people who are thinking about scholarship that you might want to have a look at, sort of echoing really some of the things James is saying about making sure that students are using academic register when they're talking to each other, and encouraging them with discussion. We moved away a little bit, haven't we, of developing oracy in students, and I think that's now something that's really coming back, but making sure that it's not just half sentences and half thought through ideas. It's making sure they've really thought about it. There's a very interesting question, James, that I want to pose to you. I don't know the answer at all, and I don't know whether you've thought about it. It's got 3 parts to it, so I'll read it all out to you, but you probably the last one is probably the really interesting one. Is it possible for every child to access the mainstream secondary curriculum? Should our mainstream secondary curriculum be accessible to every child? And this last one, maybe you want to have some thoughts on. Is it right to make, or to want to make, every student a scholar?
That's a really valid point. I guess it all links to the definition of scholarship, right? It's all about, does scholarship mean being the top of your game in your field? At this school, it doesn't. It means that every child, as much as possible, we try to instill that love of learning for a subject. So there'll be children who are turned off by maths. There are children who are turned off by PE, children who are turned off by all subjects. So how do you instill a love of learning? And that's a big chunk of what our scholarship looks like here. And it doesn't work for every kid. It doesn't work for every class. And you try and you try and you try, and you're never going to crack all those tough nuts. But that's such a good question, because I think it roots down to the definition of scholarship. So for you to want to know more about a subject, for you want to try in that subject, for you to make progress in that subject is you showing evidence of being scholarly in that field. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a scholar whatsoever. I'm not a scientist. I couldn't hack the lab. I kept dropping and breaking test tubes and cost the lab too much money, and I wasn't smart enough to be a doctor like everyone else. So I'm not a scholar. So I have a love of learning though, and I like to learn more and more. And when kids see that you like learning, they get excited by your excitement of that as well. And I think that answered the first 2 questions. Sorry, Charlie. Well,
yeah, no, I like the answer. I enjoyed it. I'm just going to sort of ask, sort of it joins perhaps from that question with another one there, and then one that I'd written down myself, which I'm thinking about sort of the year 7s that come in. You have a comprehensive intake. There will be some students that come in who've had quite a difficult primary experience, who perhaps have got lower than average literacy levels and do not have a love of learning age 11. And I wondered what practical tips or things that you do in order to really boost, some of whom are disadvantaged students. You know, what do you do with those students to really grab them?
Yeah. Know much about lab where we're based. It's in Blackheath, but none of our kids live in Blackheath. They're all based in Woolwich, Charlton, and I think we've got joint bottom attainment for the kids across the whole trust, and they come in with their Key Stage 2 data. So that kind of, those gaps are really, really prevalent. And chances are, if a kid doesn't love learning by the end of primary school, then it's only going to get worse at secondary school. You know, how many primary school kids love maths and they get to secondary school and they start hating it? And I'm not saying maths teachers secondary schools are bad. They're not. It's the same for science. It's how it's, you know, they've gone from where their focus is, or just fun experiments or drawing pretty things. Like that's not what it is at secondary school. So looking at your curriculum, making sure it's engaging, looking at the area that you live in, what is your context? What is the level of diversity you have here? We're inner city London school, so we've got a mixed intake. So if, you know, our year 9s last year were there's about 22% of them are Nigerian or Ghanaian. So one of the texts that they studied in year 9 was a Nigerian text piece, and that switched engagement on so much for those, particularly those boys who don't really like reading. And you'd see them dotted around the school reading this book. One, because it was given to them by school, and I didn't have to take it home. But two, because I think they enjoyed reading something where they could recognise themselves or be at an advantage, because they're the only ones in the class that could pronounce the names of the characters. They're the only ones that understand what region they're talking about there. And I think, when you're dealing with those kids who are coming from those disadvantaged backgrounds, kind of learning the language they talk and trying to use that with them rather than against them is really powerful. We have a one-to-one Chromebook device scheme. We're going into our 4th year of it now, and that's extremely powerful. That massively levels the playing. No one pays Chromebook, and everyone gets one. So ultimately, it means that everyone has the same access to resources. So tips to get is: can your school afford a virtual library? Like programs like mine, tens of thousands of books that every child has access to. By the time a child is 11, the majority of the attainment gap's already decided because of the vocabulary gap, because of the lack of access they've got to words. Charlie, you know this better than me as an English specialist, but the child from a middle-class home knows like an average of 35 million words compared to a disadvantaged home knows 15 million words. It's shocking. So that access to reading things is really, really important, and put might behind it. So every single one of our lessons starts with 5-minute silence reading. Every single lesson, and that's either a physical book or it's on their Chromebook. And you put on tablet mode, so you make sure that they're actually reading and not on or mucking around on this or that, or doing their homework, which I found out this morning someone in my class was doing. And you make that part of your culture. And it's really easy when you're starting from scratch, but why not start? I'm really aware that I'm speaking 408 miles an hour, so I'm really sorry, everyone. My students get it, but it takes about 3 weeks until they understand what the hell I'm saying. So ultimately, like putting that culture in place. Maybe start with your year 7s then, or introducing it to year 7, 8, 9. Okay, now we're going to read. And if your school doesn't want to do that, then why don't they just start silently reading a subject-specific piece of text from your article? I think the whole trust has access to The Day, which is a great resource and often used for tutor time and PSHE, but it got a tab for every single subject. Why isn't that on the board or shared on the Google Classrooms for them to read? To get them that access is massively important.
Thank you. That's a good answer. I've also read the chat, which is a long discussion between a few people around vocabulary and whether whether our focus on vocabulary at the moment. We all know that the most recent research around kind of closing the gap is around vocabulary and also the wider context. Some people call that the cultural capital, and that having that widening that knowledge base, which obviously I know has informed your curriculum. There's an interesting discussion on the chat around whether teaching vocabulary doesn't instill a love of learning, as in potentially kind of it can be so prescriptive that it makes it quite dry. I'm not gonna ask you to expand on that because we're actually going to finish this off in a minute, but it's if anybody wants to quickly skim through the chat, it's quite an interesting one there. I think sort of some of the things that I just want to pull out that you've talked about is around the subject knowledge from the teachers being key, the opportunities in PD to develop specific subject pedagogy so that teachers feel like an expert in their field, so that they can model that and encourage that in their lessons. The importance of getting students to talk in an academic register, to challenge each other. There was a question around how you manage that in case, so that it doesn't turn into a discussion between perhaps 4 of the most vocal and confident students. And it's obviously about managing that so that you're drawing in other students, which I think is just, the quality first teaching, isn't it? And making sure that you do draw in those students. And then you've talked sort of like, lastly, you've talked around kind of developing a love and a passion for learning and academics. So thank you so much, James, for putting yourself out there and doing this. Thank you so much, everybody who's contributed in the chat, but also for choosing to come along to this session. I hope that it's been enjoyable. I think it's amazing to have somebody who's practicing within our academies talk to everybody about it. I think it takes real bravery, James. So good for you. And thank you very much. Have a really lovely evening, everybody. Thank you.